The Westland Wyvern is a perplexing beast, to say the least. A bit more of an obscure plane. They were produced right after World War II, and given they're driven by a prop, that does seem odd. After all, that's when jets were starting to come into the fold, but for reasons I'll get to, the Wyvern did see service. They had a crew of 1, unless you're talking about the T3 model, in which case they had 2, a length of 42 feet 3 inches, a wingspan of 44 feet exactly, a height of 15 feet 9 inches, a gross weight of 21,200 pounds, and they were powered by a single Armstrong Siddeley Python turboprop engine that could deliver 3,560 horsepower, and their propellers were 4-bladed rotal contra-rotating, 13 feet in diameter, driving them to a maximum speed of 383 miles per hour at sea level and 380 miles per hour at 10,000 feet. Now, all that puts the Wyvern in a really weird position for being after World War II. That sounds slow, kinda, and they're driven by a prop, but they are a turboprop. And the turboprop element is probably one of their most notable traits. At that time, turboprops were still fairly underutilized, and you didn't see them very often. But the production version of the Wyvern did have one, and that at least partially allowed them to enjoy a short but decent military career. Development on the Wyvern did start during World War II, but as we've already established, they weren't actually produced until after it. In fact, the prototype wouldn't even fly until 1946. But the initial project was for a naval strike fighter, and Westland's design actually placed the engine behind the pilot, similar to the P-39. Except unlike the P-39, which did that mostly because they wanted to put a big Chungus cannon in the nose, the Wyvern did it for the other benefit of putting the engine back there, which was nose streamlining as well as improving pilot visibility. Again, they were developing a naval craft, so giving the pilot the best possible view was something that they felt was important for carrier operations. There was official interest in the project, and that resulted in the Air Ministry specification N.11/44, looking for a long-range naval fighter using the 24-cylinder H-block Rolls-Royce Eagle 22 piston engine. Yes, it should probably be stated, early on, the Wyvern was not necessarily meant to use a turboprop. The specification called for a traditional piston engine, but at the same time, the specification also wanted the airframe to be designed in such a way that it could also accept a turboprop when a suitable unit became available. They didn't have one back then, but they thought they might, so they wanted this aircraft to be able to accept that type of engine should it be possible. And maybe some of you are confused, what is a turboprop exactly? We haven't talked about them very much on the channel, they just haven't come up, but I'll give you a brief summation. Basically, a turboprop is, well, some people consider it kind of a fusion of a jet engine and a propeller-style engine, and that's not wrong, but it's not right either. In layman's terms, basically, a turboprop does actually utilize a turbine, except instead of utilizing it in the form of a turbojet or turbofan, this energy is utilized to spin a propeller, and they are much better for lower-speed aircraft. Jets in particular usually aren't very efficient at speeds under 450 miles per hour or so. But turboprops are fine, and modern turboprop airliners, while being able to operate at roughly the same speed as smaller regional jets, wind up burning 2/3 of the fuel per passenger. And compared to more traditional piston engines, they have a much better power-to-weight ratio, allowing for shorter takeoffs, for example. So basically, a turboprop kind of combines benefits of both sides of the equation here. They're in their own little world, but they are seen quite often in the modern day, and honestly, if you've ever ridden in a modern airliner that uses propellers, I can almost guarantee it was a turboprop. Anywho, back to the Wyvern. As I said, this specification was for the Royal Navy, but there was a parallel one for the Royal Air Force, but the RAF variant would wind up being cancelled because they decided they wanted all their future fighters to be jets. However, that didn't stop the Wyvern's continual development for the Navy. Jets and aircraft carriers, especially early on, were a difficult thing to address. So the Navy, while they were interested in jets too, of course, were more willing to accept a more modern prop at the same time as a bit of a stopgap, whereas the RAF wanted to rush straight into jets right then and there. The design would eventually result in the initial prototype that actually had an Eagle engine, a piston one, but in the nose, where the final design wouldn't do that. Why? What is happening? I told you, the Wyvern's very odd. The prototype had a piston engine in the nose, but it did have those contra-rotating propellers, which would stick around. The cockpit also sat rather high, again to improve visibility. But outside of that, it was pretty much a conventional plane for the era. The prototype would first fly on December 16, 1946, though she would actually be lost just the following year, October 1947, when the propeller bearings failed in flight. The pilot was killed and attempted to make an emergency landing. But outside of that slightly major issue, testing went alright. But around that same time, the Eagle engine was cancelled, and there were insufficient pre-production engines available to complete the prototypes they'd been working on. As such, a new specification, N.12/45, was issued for what was known as the Wyvern TF2, which was supposed to be powered by a turboprop engine, either the Rolls-Royce Clyde or the Armstrong Siddeley Python. A single prototype was ordered with the Clyde, and two were ordered with the Pythons. Clyde 1 would first fly on January 18, 1949, but the Clyde engine would also be cancelled by Rolls-Royce, so they wound up having to stick with the Pythons. The first of those flew on March 22, 1949, and that particular aircraft introduced an ejection seat to the design. While the design was heralded at the time as being pretty revolutionary, there were a lot of different changes implemented over the 3 years they were still in testing. Also, the Python engines weren't very easy to work with. They were notoriously temperamental and hated minor throttle adjustments, meaning that instead of messing with the throttle, control was exercised by running the engine at a constant speed and varying the pitch of the propellers. They wouldn't be ready for service until 1952, and the TF2s never reached an operational squadron. But one version of the Wyvern, the TF4, did enter service. By the time production ended, they produced 127 airframe, with 124 aircraft completed. Pre-production Wyvern TF2s were trialed on board HMS Illustrious on June 21, 1950. But the TF4s, also known as the S4s, wouldn't enter service until May 1953 with the 813th Naval Air Squadron. But at the time, they still hadn't been cleared for carrier operations. That was only issued in April of 1954. As such, they only remained in service between 1954 and 1958, and their service life wasn't exactly smooth. There was something that was noticed when it came to launching from a carrier. On catapult launches, their engines had a habit of flaming out. The high Gs that were put on the airframe during that time caused fuel starvation, and a number of the planes would be lost off of the bow of HMS Albion. This would also lead to some history being made. Lieutenant B.D. McFarlane, on October 13, 1954, successfully ejected underwater after his Wyvern had ditched on launch and been cut in two by the Albion. The Wyverns did eventually see combat as well on board the HMS Eagle. They would fly 79 sorties during Operation Musketeer, which was an armed response to the Suez Crisis. 2 of the Wyverns would be lost to damage from light anti-aircraft fire, though the pilots of both aircraft successfully ejected and were picked up by search and rescue. Those sorties would be the only time Wyverns actually saw combat. They'd be withdrawn from service by 1958, because, simply put, they weren't needed. The problem with the Wyvern had to do with timing here. I think it's pretty obvious. As cool as they are with the contra-rotating propellers and the turboprop engines, they're still props. And when it comes to fighters, jets were coming into the fold and developing rather rapidly, to the point that they could also handle carrier operations just as well, if not better, and provide superior performance once in the air. Due to this, the Wyvern was kind of just pushed to the side. But for whatever it is worth, a single Wyvern did survive into preservation. She is one of the pre-production aircraft, as well as the last one to be fitted with the original Eagle piston engine, and she remains on display at the Fleet Air Arm Museum in Yeovilton, England. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders, Somedude267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Jack Carson's Roy Videos, Lord Off 444, Royal Hudson 2060, Isurfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matt Weaver, Tom Redlion, NS Productions 8104, Wheeljack 8401, Rescues Greyhounds, The Baxter, Caleb Crosswhite, Andrew Bowen, Josh Johnson, Caleb Brainwaters, Prez Drenton, Master of None, Travis Alinsky, Jared Brussel, Joshua Long, Tommy Rossini, Ben Nicola, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Mark Holding, G Wiz, Mr. Revel, Hayden DeGrow, Metal for Life Guy, No, Eric Hutton, Kirk Forkham, Ohio Trucker 1, Mitchell Cole, Mr. Sleepy, Dr. Race 78, Nylon, AET Museum, Railroad Preserver 2000, Williard Conklin, Windy City Rails, Liam Wright, DM Tribal Typhoon, Harry, Hannah Bird, and of course, my dad. Till next time, this is Darkness, individual of fun, farewell.